Okay, first of all, I want to thank the foundation for having me here. As you can see, I changed the title a little bit. The original title is Capitalism Made in China. I thought the title sounds a little inevitable, like everything will happen inevitably. So I changed the title to, I think, to show the future is being made by people. Okay, so this year actually marks the 50th anniversary of the global internet. And after 50 years of development, the global internet has become the dominant medium for global and public communication. Although it's hardly a flattening infrastructure, the topography of the internet looks very different today than 50 years ago or even 25 years ago. As we know, East Asia now has the largest number of internet users. North American and Western Europe continue to lead in terms of the penetration rate, whereas Africa is also enjoying, witnessing the fastest growth rates of internet users. So I would suggest that in a dialectical sense, the global internet is entering a post-American era. So it's really a dialectical process. On the one hand, dominant ideas, interests, and arrangements emanating from the United States continue to matter. They mingle, align, or conflict with states, capitals, and social actors in various parts of the world. So in a largely asymmetric fashion, they are assembled into the global internet, made up of supranational entities, corporate infrastructures, production trains, and networked publics. But on the other hand, global economic crisis, the so-called the rise of the rest, have put in motion the continuity and the discontinuity of political economies, shaping and being shaped by the global internet. The rise of emerging countries, including but not limited to China, India, Brazil, and Russia, is redefining a global internet landscape. These countries redefine the global internet through their respective histories, political economies, and social ethnography. So we are really witnessing what Dan Schiller has called a multilateral direction of global digital capitalism. And the ongoing disputes over Huawei, the Chinese company, really best illustrates the extent of digital interdependency and as well as discontinuity. So Huawei's case can tell us a lot. Over the past decades, the United States has led the efforts of extending the liberal capitalist model to cyberspace. But let's not forget, globalization driven as such, driven by technology and capital, is always mediated by states and is always accompanied by geopolitics. While transnational companies from developed countries have invested heavily in China, they also manage to control technological transfer so as to command the transnational value chain and to preserve their competitive advantage. And as some of you may know, Huawei tries to enter the United States, the U.S. market from the beginning of the 21st century, but the company's attempts has been repeatedly thwarted for national security reasons. At the same time, if we look at from the China side, from developing countries side, many important developing countries made steadfast progress in terms of global digital convergence. But a country like China also preserved some crucial political, economic, as well as ideological foundation for self-determination. In recent years, the rise of conservative nationalism and xenophobia in the global north has further exacerbated the fragmented nature of the existing global order. And these anti-globalization trends further provoked counter-proposals, alternative narratives, and a new arrangement, often coming from the global south. People are prompted to ask, will the post-American internet move towards a more representative model of freedom, democracy, security, and development? China, of course, is a big variable in moving ahead. China has a rather mixed success story of globalization. During China's globalization process, the country exercised a bundle of open or tacit strategies to harness globalization. And the bundle includes, for example, hosting transnational capacities, selectively protecting domestic market and supporting homegrown standards. And in doing so, the country manages to build a parallel digital ecosystem in collaboration with and also in competition with Silicon Valley-dominated system. So many wants to know, how would so-called global digital China impact relations, resources, and protocols materialized by the internet inside and outside of the country? To answer that question, let's first revisit history. We will start with the global economic crisis that broke out 10 years ago. The crisis really functioned as a public lesson, revealing long-standing global structural imbalances. At that time, back around 2008, China was tagged as a world factory. The country had a high level of saving, a low level of value added, and also a low level of residential income. In the aftermath of the crisis, the Chinese states realized that the old model, only focusing on GDP growth, had run its course, and therefore the whole country, including the state, engaged in a critical rethinking of developmental model in a way that haven't been seen before. So since then, the Chinese state has shown ample determination to move to an innovation-driven and consumption-based growth model. And in this process, communication across the entire range, from telecommunications to broadband internet, from mobile communication to digital media, has occupied a central position to facilitating China's economic restructuring. The state took a slew of actions around communication to create a new investment outlets, to stimulate information consumption, and to bring about innovation. All these discrete initiatives coalesced into a grand strategy of what I call networking China. So my research revealed several important historical lessons. The first lesson is about the varied extent to which states and societies exercise their independent interpretation of globalization, even at the peak of neoliberalism. And the varied extent really depends on a particular country's capacity, interest, and value. And this picture is taken around 1994, 1995 by someone I don't know. It's not a terribly nice picture, but it really captures the historical context within which China and the internet find each other. It was the end of the Cold War when capitalism was announced as the only game in town. The US, United States, or the world with its techno-economic prowess, as well as by its futuristic information superhighway concept. Whereas across the Pacific Ocean, China has just survived a series of domestic and international crises. And of course, 1994 was only a beginning of China's engagement and catch-up. If we take a longer view over history, we have to agree with John King Fairbank that the whole 20th century was made up of a long series of domestic struggles on the part of China trying to adjust to the new Eurocentric capitalist system. So in this longer view, the Chinese Communist Party, or what we call the party state, was both a revolutionary and a nationalist party. It gained ruling legitimacy not only from leading anti-imperialism and anti-capitalist struggles, but also from its nationalist and even modernist commitment for rejuvenating the nation from internal backwardness and external subjugation. So during Mao's era, the state exercised socialist sovereignty to build Third Front project. And the whole project was meant to ramp up heavy and defense industries in interior provinces of China, far away from the coastal line. So as a result, provinces like Sichuan, Chongqing, Shanxi had a strong lead in electronics and machinery production. And then when Mao's reign came to the end, when the market reform started, most of these third front enterprises went through downsizing, bankruptcy, and restructuring. But even in that circumstances, these enterprises contributed to China's export economy and globalizing economy for having trained a whole generation of research and development talents and for having accumulated very precious manufacturing know-how. So the lesson that I want to share is about the analytical necessity to de-reify the state on the one hand, and to de-abstract the state's varied relations with various categories of capital on the other. Western commentaries often render China's internet in a state territorial imagery. And this is a classic example, and it shows how much reunification is going there. The state is being constructed as the opposite against individualist democracy or against the market freedom. But history shows a more flexible state as embedded, being part of, or being recursive with economy and the society at large. So, for example, the state really took a differentiated approach towards global convergence and liberalization, depending on the importance of a particular communicative sectors. And during the opening up process, the state also internalized liberal ideologies and practices. And so, in this table, what you can see is really a hybrid economy, as characterizing communication landscape. And still, despite the state's overseeing role, this measured, paced approach towards globalization and liberalization has created unexpected results and has entangled global factors with so-called national champions or national plans. So this means that we need to, first of all, recognize that Chinese party state is indeed a very strong party state. But at the same time, we should caution against overstating the power and unity of the Chinese state. And also, we don't want to camouflage both differentiated as well, and just as important, evolving relations between the state and the different categories of capital. So as networking China has become a very important economic restructuring instrument or approach, and this approach is deeply entangled with global restructuring, which is still ongoing. So we should anticipate the process creates new social conflicts, unexpected power shift, and inevitable geopolitical struggle. So what happened since then? Here are some simple observations. The internet and the internet-enabled digitization has become unprecedentedly important for the Chinese economy. The internet enables ICT to integrate with all sorts of social economic operation. In recent years, I think this year or last year, digital economy, loosely defined, accounts for 1/3 of China's GDP. And the internet capital is also globalizing along with capitals in other categories of business. China's BAT, the three major internet companies, are expanding digitally enabled business models and investing in local competitors and partners, especially in Southeast Asia. And the state is facilitating the Digital Silk Road project. Network infrastructures is an investment priority for China's Silk Road Fund and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Just as internet has facilitated and reshaped China's relationship with the global system through technology, talent, capital, and trade, what happens on the level of governance? What does China want to achieve in terms of governing? And what has China achieved? My collaborators and I did some exploration. Instead of using innate particularity to explain or to predict China's governing logic, we posit an evolutionary nature of governance, an outcome of both external pressure and internal choices. So I'm going to share a few recent projects. The first project looked at cyber sovereignty as opposed to the multi-stakeholder model. We find that multi-stakeholder model evokes, and this model is a kind of a taken for granted model led by Western countries, right? So this model evokes pluralistic participation, but unfortunately extended the northern bias against the redistributive deficit. So this bias gave rise to alternative politics centered on sovereign authorities. China is a major advocate, but what exactly does China mean by cyber sovereignty, which is a really ambiguous and contested term? So we did some discourse inquiry. What we find is that the Chinese vision frames sovereignty as a state responsibility for collective rights, but not exactly in terms of Westphalian absolute autonomy. For sure, the Chinese state wants to use cyber sovereignty to extend multipolar direction of digital development, but it also extends contestation beyond issues such as security and privacy to material well-being, developmental justice, and even alternative planetary futures. On the grounds that the old information order is fragmented and lacking equal access, the Chinese vision embraces the unmet longings of the developing global South. We also did some policy analysis, and our analysis shows that the Chinese state is aware that the state itself is not the only governing subject, and that its actions are subject to contestation and disagreement. So what the Chinese government is doing is to forge a state-led multi-stakeholder model and expresses boundaries both as its preference and also as compromise. Therefore, policies vary between inward-looking unilateralism meant to consolidating the power of the state and outward-looking advocacy for a multilateral global internet order. Apart from the ambiguous concepts such as cyber sovereignty, we also looked at policy and institutional arrangement underpinning China's digital boom, and especially the platform economy. We want to know what give rise to these platform economy, and given so much contradictions and paradoxes surrounding the platforms. It is well reported that platforms companies like Alibaba have enjoyed rapid growth for hosting copycats. So on the one hand, it is creating jobs, creating business opportunities, but at the same time, it is creating trouble for the state and for the public. So how to explain that paradox? Well, we find that this paradox partly managed to exist because of the legal principle of platform immunity. Under this legal principle, platforms can host online activities without being held legally liable for third-party speech and action. So does this kind of situation, does this legal arrangement represent a tight fusion between the Chinese state and a domestic corporate giant? I think the answer is not so straightforward. What we find is that tension interactions, not a tight fusion of interest, define platform governance, especially tensions between local and global expectations between legal, judicial, and administrative bodies. We did some historical research, and we find that platform immunity itself was a Western invention. It was a Western transplantation. But before its adoption by the Chinese state, Chinese authorities subject web portals and bulletin boards to strict liabilities in order to comply with the WTO requirements. But then later on, in order to follow new best practices from the West and also to honor pro-internet ethos in domestic law and business communities, the government moderated its blanket stance, and since then, platform immunity as a principle, as a top-down principle, has been adopted and has come to co-articulate with a grassroots practice of counterfeiting. But ultimately, these contemporary collusion is unstable. The monopoly power of platforms sparks conflict between local and global expectations and between corporate and public interests. And something has to be done. Something has to be changed. People find that legal rules and informal culture are slow to change. So the administrative authorities become a driving force for change. They extend regulatory oversight to flagship platforms and requiring them to set up the notice and the takedown mechanism. But still, the legal and the judicial system follows an ad hoc approach of layering legal duties on platform immunity principle. So therefore, loopholes continue to exist for new platforms, for small corporate vendors, and for countless micro entrepreneurs. Lastly, we also examined China's expansion overseas, and we looked at China's ICT aid as an instrument of achieving governing goals. And so again, to go beyond a homogeneous Chinese model, we reconceptualized the so-called Chinese state capital, and we see Chinese state capital as made up of various actors, including state agencies, state-owned enterprises, and even large private actors with strong ties with the state. So it's very important to recognize that these ensemble, these historical assemblage, pursue competing imperatives through foreign aid. And sometimes they want to redress infrastructure deficit in African continent. Sometimes they want to sell Chinese equipment. Other times they want to support resource extracting businesses. And other times they want to buttress local politicians. And just as important, while the range of Chinese actors strive to achieve their own political and economic needs, the inclusion of African agencies in the aid implementation network is likely to open up into more interactive space to aid recipients and to their local needs. So what we find is basically 3 empirical results. We find that ICT aid is distributed to a diverse portfolio of countries, but with unique strategies on what countries are receiving more. So Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia are the countries that receive the most of the largest amount of ICT aid. And in the first-tier national telecom markets like Egypt, Tunisia, Kenya, Chinese vendors, Huawei and ZTE in particular, have gained strong foothold through their own initiative. So they gained market success without the state support. But beyond this first-tier category, the size of a national market does not predict the allocation of ICT aid. And the third finding is that China's Export and Import Bank, ZTE and Huawei, have instituted their own network power by collaborating with a range of partners, Chinese and Africa. And so the diversity of local partners they are collaborating with are likely to open up more interactive space so that local needs can be heard and can be addressed. So looking forward, I think it's suffice to say I would suggest that China and the so-called post-American internet are co-constituting each other. And we need to really go beyond various renditions of digital sublime and to understand the internet as a social-technical processes. So by social-technical processes, we want to emphasize the social dimension of the internet. We want to understand the internet is shaped by social relations and political relations. So therefore, whose knowledge and whose needs are prioritized and who make those decisions are key questions. So a caution for epistemological parochialism and methodological nationalism is necessary here. Oftentimes, internet-related governance studies are based on liberal values and Western context. Such model, either descriptive or prescriptive, is insufficient for explaining or supporting a range of premises, protocols, and practices. So ultimately, we see the internet as a space of disagreement and possibility. Here we can trace the negotiation of actors across multiple scales and from various contexts. States are part of these disagreement space, but states are inevitably interacting with non-traditional power structures made up of corporate and social actors. And still, one cannot underestimate the agency of the states. States can adapt, contracting or expanding their power. So moving forward, as the internet turns 50 years old, whose global village it is a key question. So let me end with a positive message from China. That is to jointly build a community with a shared future in cyberspace. Thank you.